Just to begin, we're coming off of chapter 41 that had many very important and very significant themes and points. Just to mention one which is important going forward. The main point going forward that we have to know from chapter 41 is that we established that love without having this stage of awe, the proper awe and respect, yira, as we explained in the previous chapter, without fear, without the proper awe, the service is not really a service. It's more falls into the category of new age, feel good, serve God with what makes me feel happy. I feel complete, I feel whole, this feels right to me. Ultimate service is putting self aside, and that's what we established. Now, just to know, we mentioned that there are two levels of fear. Until now, we're only discussing the lower level of fear, of awe. There's a much more profound level where one is completely overwhelmed by the greatness of the one that he is serving. We're going to talk about that later. Right now, this chapter is basing itself on the general concept that in order to serve God, you have to have this profound level of, when I say profound, I mean, as we just explained, the depth of awe. It's not a fear of like you're afraid of something. It's not that you're scared. It's a recognition that I am insignificant compared to this great, giant, awesome God in front of me. And that puts you in a place where you put self aside. And then when you have love, it's a true love. It's not a love that's all about me. It's a love about the one I'm loving. Okay, and we explain this in relationships with a husband and wife. We explained it in many formats. Based on this, we're going to go forward now. And this chapter is unique, probably one of the ways that the Alter Rebbe is really addressing, not I want to say our failings, but our imperfections, our challenges, with areas where we seem to lack, and helping us achieve and showing us how accessible it is to achieve a great level of service to God. In other words, he's taking into consideration our imperfections, our humanistic limitations. He understands our challenges, our failings as human beings, that we're human. And nevertheless, he's showing us with our failings, with our imperfections, with our challenges, how we can achieve an ultimate service of God. That's really what we're doing with this chapter. So he starts off, and this chapter is actually very famous, and you'll notice some topics being discussed here that are discussed in many areas of Hasidus. Okay. Chapter 42. V'hinei v'masher of le'el b'inyan yirat. This that we started explaining before in chapter 41 regarding the lower level of fear, the lower level of awe. And that's what we just mentioned. Yuvan Hativ, we now could understand very clearly Masher of the Gemara. The Gemara has a discussion, tractate of Brachot, the Brachas. The Gemara discusses Moshe Rabeinu's travels and experiences with the Jewish people in the desert, included many challenges of the Jewish people. Many times they sort of they went against Moshe, they rebelled against Moshe, they questioned God, they challenged God. And Moshe turns to the Jewish people and says, the Ati Yisrael, and now the Gemara addresses this verse. It says there in the Torah, the Ata Yisrael, and now Jewish people, Ma Hashem Olekecha Shel Me'imach. What does God want from you already? What's he asking? Hi'im liyiras Hashem Olekecha. All he wants from you is to fear God. That's all the things he's asking you. Just understand, the Gemara explains there, Rabbi Chanina says there in the Gemara, that as we spoke earlier in the first page of Tanya, if you remember going back a few years ago when we started Tanya, the first page discussed that when a soul comes down to this world, the angel takes the seed that's going to create the child, and he brings the seed before God, and he says to God, what's the plan with this one? And will he be rich? Will he be poor? Will he be wise? Will he be simple? Will he be healthy? Will he be ill? Meaning, what's his challenges in life? What's his story in life? And everything about a person is predetermined. If you'll be wealthy is predetermined. If you'll be poor is predetermined. How wealthy, how poor, how this, that's all up to you. But the general concepts of being healthy, or being a person that is challenged all your life with health issues, or you're challenged with having, all the matters of life are predetermined. Who are you going to marry? What property you're going to own? What boats you're going to own? Everything is predetermined. How much and how you access it, that's already another discussion. But everything is discussed except one thing. Will you be God-fearing? If you will be God-fearing, that is not discussed. That is up to you. And that's the one thing God leaves in the hands of a human being, to be God-fearing or not. This is what Moshe Rabeinu is saying. What does God want from you? Everything he planned out for you already. All he wants to ask you to do is to be God-fearing. Why are you guys having such a challenge? What's the story, guys? All God asks from you is to be God-fearing. The Gemara asks a question, and this question is actually even more of a question after the previous chapter. Is fearing God so easy? Remember Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai quoted this story as he was passing away at the age of 120. He turns to his followers that are gathered around his bed, and he says that if only you had the fear of God like the fear of another person, and he describes the challenge of having a fear of God. Fear of God is not so simple. We see people, we see things, we don't see God. God is not something you see. We believe it, we understand it. Our logic tells us there has to be a creator, but we don't see God. We don't fear God naturally. What's Moshe Rabeinu telling the Jewish people? What's wrong with you guys? All God wants you to do is to fear God. So that's what the Gemara asks. The Gemara says, Atu yira milsa zodrasahi. Is fearing God so simple that Moshe Rabeinu could say to the Jewish people, hey, all God's asking is like, all I'm asking you is to pick up a small piece of paper. He's asking you to be aware of a godly power and to have a sensation to it, be sensitive to it, be aware of it, change yourself, change your behavior. It's not a simple thing. That's the Gemara's question. And the Gemara answers in, or some say in, depends how you style the Gemara, in or in. Legabe Moshe milsa zodrasahi v'chulu. The Gemara answers yes. For Moshe Rabeinu, it's easy. Moshe is the speaker here. For Moshe to have fear of God, it's very easy. That is the Gemara. On this Gemara, obviously, it is a very quick question that is asked and addressed by many commentators on the Talmud. Many sources discuss this question, and the question is a very obvious question. Moshe wasn't talking to himself. Imagine you have a guy who is a bodybuilder, and he's really strong, and he could lift tremendous amounts of weight. And he picks up like a 500-pound weight, and he lifts it up easily, and he says to this 3-year-old kid or 5-year-old kid, hey, you, come on, lift this up. And someone says, come on, it's difficult to lift it up. He says, not for the strong guy. We're not talking about the strong guy. Moshe is talking to the Jewish people. They should have fear. What type of answer is it we say is having fear of God so simple? And we say, yeah, for Moshe, it's simple. Moshe wasn't demanding it of himself. He was demanding it of the people. So how does that make sense? How does that work out to say that, yes, it's easy for Moshe Rabeinu? I wasn't asking if Moshe Rabeinu should do it. There's a famous discussion in the Talmud, actually right there on that same page, there's a discussion that says as follows. How do you determine if something is easy or hard, big or small? The answer is if you have it. For an example, go to a wealthy man and ask him to give $1,000, $100,000 to buy himself a yacht, to buy whatever you need, to that much money. To him, if you go to Bill Gates or you go to Zuckerberg or all these wealthy people, Bezos, to go and get $100,000, $1 million, is nothing. Go to a poor guy who has nothing, ask him for $20. Meaning that if something is big or small, it all depends on the person and their resources. So how could we say that Moshe Rabeinu tells the Jewish people it's easy when the Jewish people don't have it accessible like Moshe? For Moshe Rabeinu, fear of God is easy. Moshe was born holy. He was born circumcised. The second he arrived on this planet, he was holy. It says his light, the home filled up with light. He was a holy child from birth. For him to be God-fearing is natural. There are people who are born like that, very holy, righteous people, as we'll see in a minute. For the average person, to be God-fearing is a tremendous journey. And it's not a one-time fix. It's a journey day in, day out, no different than someone who is on recovery from being an alcoholic. That you can't say, well, every single day is a challenge. We are addicts to our body, to our needs, to our temptations. And every day is a struggle. So what do you mean that it's an easy thing because Moshe, it's easy? That's the question we're going to ask now. And even though this question is asked by many other commentators, we're going to focus on the Alter Rebbe's insight. And this really is one of the great places where we see that, the Alter Rebbe taught, his name was called Shneor Zalman. Shneor Zalman. Shneor means two lights. The Alter Rebbe was known to merge the knowledge of the revealed Torah, Talmud, and all those areas. And I'll actually, Fred, a good question. I'll address that in a second. Good question. And he basically took the light of the revealed Torah, like Talmud and Jewish law, and the light of Hasidus, and he merged them into one. Here's a place where you see it's hard to understand the Chumash or the Talmud without learning Hasidus, because only the Hasidus answer really satisfies the question. According to all the other answers, they're very complex. The Maharal HaPrag gives an answer, the Maharsha, very complicated answers. Only the Alter Rebbe's answer is like a simple, clear answer. Frida asked a good question, very good question. Wasn't this maybe seemingly addressed to the generation of Moshe Rabeinu's times, who they were in fact a very holy and a great knowledgeable generation? And the answer is very good, good point. They were definitely on a whole higher level than all of us, much, much more advanced in understanding of God, knowledge of God. Nevertheless, we see the challenges they had. We see the bottom line is that every single time, every person, this gets into another whole idea, Frida. I don't want to go too much into it, but it's worth mentioning briefly. Every single person is challenged based on their capabilities. That means it's very possible that the more righteous person has a greater temptation and a greater challenge. We see back in the times of the kings of Israel, the great King Manasseh, many other kings, many other great ones fell to worship idols and did other sins and other very significant transgressions. How is that possible? And the answer given is we don't know how strong and how hard the Satan worked. In other words, we have to appreciate, we had a few weeks ago the story of Midian and the story of Zimri, the leader of the Jewish people, one of the 12 leaders who goes and has a relationship with a princess of Midian in front of Moshe Rabeinu. The whole story, as you know, Pinchas later killed them both. How could it be this guy? His name was Shlomiel ben Tzuri Shaddai. We call him Zimri, but his name was Shlomiel ben Tzuri Shaddai, a great leader amongst the Jews. Not just that. This was a daughter of one of the kings of Midian, who they used. Why? Their goal was to entice Moshe Rabeinu. Imagine. They were trying to get Moshe Rabeinu to sin with a woman, and it ended up that she sinned with this woman, this prince, instead of the Jewish people. How's that possible? Because the greater you are, there's no such a thing as a person that's not challenged. You might have a much more different challenge, a more complicated challenge, but every single Jew and every single human being has challenges in life. And while you might see someone as a much more righteous person, their challenges come in a different form. And therefore, the generation of the desert, they, as we see many times, succumb to their challenges, and they sinned, and God oftentimes, unfortunately, killed them in plagues, as we just saw, that we just read in the Chumash. But Moshe Rabeinu actually this week in the Chumash is recounting all these events that happened in the desert. We started the book of Devarim this week, the final book. The bottom line is that they seem to have the same challenge of fearing of God, but on their level, not on our level, because they were a whole different level. But getting back to our point, the question is, how could we answer that from Moshe Rabeinu? It's easy. Why does that help if it's easy from Moshe Rabeinu? The challenges are being given to us. So to understand this, the answer we're going to give is a very fundamental answer, which is a basic idea in all of Hasidus and all of Torah teachings. And that is, he's going to explain it in this chapter, and that is that every single Jewish person has a little shine, a little ray, a little bit of Moshe Rabeinu inside of him. There's a very sweet song that I like. It's from, if you ever want to Google it, it's from Eighth Day, the band called Eighth Day. And it's a great song. They took a lot of very cool ideas in Hasidus and explained it in fun songs. This song is called There's a Little Bit of Moses in You. It's talking about overcoming challenges because you got inside you. You just got to reach inside. There's a bit of Moses in every single person. There is a little bit of Moshe Rabeinu in every single Jew. And the trick is to tap into it. What we're going to see, to tap into it is not so simple because it's deep, deep inside of us. So how do we tap into it? There's one person that can bring it out, Moshe Rabeinu. Because when Moshe Rabeinu looks at the Jewish people, he doesn't see them as they see themselves. He sees them as the Moshe Rabeinu sees them. And he sees their Moshe Rabeinu, their essence shining. And he says, yes, for you guys, if only you tap into your Moshe, it's easy. In other words, when Moshe Rabeinu is facing the Jewish people, he's not seeing them. When we look at our brother, our sister, another person, we see right away many of their flaws, many of their exterior characteristics that are not so perfect. But a mother looks at a child, doesn't see all the imperfections. A mother who loves the child just sees the beauty. A tzaddik like Moshe Rabeinu, when he looks at the Jew, he doesn't see your flaws. He doesn't see your imperfections. He sees you are a spark of Moshe Rabeinu inside of you. You've got Moshe. And when he sees that, it elicits and arouses and inspires and wakes up that Moshe Rabeinu. We have a very interesting topic or idea in Torah, which is as follows. The way you see someone, the way you think about someone, and the way you talk about someone affects them. There's a discussion when it comes to talking bad about somebody else, and we're talking not bad like making up a lie, this person did this. A person, a guy, for an example, that always cheats in business. Let's say, for an example, when you talk about that person in a negative way, so it says that's called Lashon Hara. And as a Lashon Hara hurts three people. It hurts the one who is speaking, It hurts the one who is listening, and it hurts the one you're speaking about. So the question is like this: the one who you're speaking about, the one who is speaking, I know why it hurts you because you're doing a sin. You're talking bad. The one who is listening, he's making it happen. He's an accessory. Well, why does it hurt the one you're speaking about? What did he do wrong? And the answer is it's not a punishment. It's a reality. If I throw schmutz or dirt on somebody, it's not a punishment that you get dirty. It's the fact that I was not nice and I threw dirt on top of you. When I speak bad about somebody else, it strengthens their flaw because they're being seen by my soul and that person's soul in that light. That means if I talk about a person that he is a shameful thief, I am strengthening his quality of or his flaw of being a thief. If I talk about a person that is, listen, it's not their fault. They went through hard times. You have to understand they're really a good person. I've actually strengthened their quality. That's true how I think about someone, or I speak about someone, or actions that I do. Everything we do, how we perceive, actually has an effect. And there's a famous story I heard from Rabbi Leader in Australia. He shares it on one of his recordings. He says he was a principal for many, many years. He talks about education. And he says about this mother who had two different kids in the school. One kid was always a very, very good kid, always doing good things. And one kid seemed to be getting in trouble a lot. One time, the better son, the good son, got in trouble. So the father and the mother came to the school and they tell Rabbi Leader, or the father said to Rabbi Leader, actually, he said, the father said it. He said, the older son, I always knew would be a failure. But this one, I'm surprised he's in trouble. He says, tell me again, the older son you always knew would be a failure? You ever think about maybe that's why he's a failure? Meaning you grew up, you raised your child with that perception. And that's, of course, with a parent, much more of a challenge affecting the child than a person talking behind their back about them. But the concept is the way you perceive someone has an effect. Therefore, when Moshe Rabeinu sees the Jews, he's not seeing them and perceiving them as the people with flaws and with all different, as we'll see in a moment, every soul has a different level, a different journey, how it gets here and how it's affected by its journey. Moshe Rabeinu sees you in your essence, how you are. And therefore, when he sees you with the spark of Moshe, he says, it's easy for you. Just happen to that Moshe. Be you. Be the real you. One of the factors that we emphasized in the previous chapter is the real you was unlike Sigmund Freud that says that it was the id. We say it's a yid. There's a yid. Your essence is good. Your essence is a Jew. Your essence is awesome. That was the whole point of why you say the whole idea of a serious nefesh means tap into the real me, the real I. So Moshe Rabeinu sees the real you. He sees the real I. And therefore, when he says to you, it's not so difficult, that's what he's talking about. And that's what we're going to see in this chapter. And he's going to go into this at length and explain this. Ella Inyan who continuing inside, Kikol Nefesh v'Nefesh v'Beis Yisrael, Yesh b'Bechinas Moshe Rabeinu Olav HaShalom. It has every single Jew, every single soul of the Jewish people has somewhat of Moshe Rabeinu inside of him. I don't want to call it a spark because a spark, as we'll see in a minute, is something very different. We'll call it a ray, we'll call it a level, we'll call it some sort of residue, but it has some Moshe Rabeinu inside of every single Jew. Why? He is one of the seven shepherds. Seven shepherds, the idea that we find discussed originally in the book of Micha, where he mentions about the seven shepherds and the 8 princes, and there's a lot of discussion what that means. The seven shepherds refer to, you find generally 2 places where it's discussed, in the Talmud and in the Zohar. In the Talmud, it tells you the 7 shepherds are Adam, his son Shais, his great-great-great-grandson, Mr. Shalach. Then it has King David. It's Abraham, Yaakov, and Moshe Rabeinu, of course, Moshe. The 7 shepherds. Other places it discusses, there's different discussions where it is. In the Zohar, it has other names. In different places, it discusses who the 7 shepherds were. But these are 7 people that give nourishment to the Jewish people. What does that mean? The Jewish people on their own have a soul, but a soul has to be fed to be nourished. One nourishes them with the idea of chesed, kindness, which is love. One nourishes with fear and awe. One nourishes them with a feeling of empathy. Each one of these 7 shepherds are the 7 primary providers of a certain attribute. So it says, because Moshe, and then the Zohar listed 7, some of the places actually list them as the 7 guests that we have, the Ushpizin that come on Sukkot. We know on every night of Sukkot comes 1 or all 7 special guests. Some say those are the 7 Ushpizin. Those are the 7 shepherds. But it depends where. The bottom line is, There are 7 people that give sustenance and life and nourishment to the Jewish people, 7 outstanding tzaddikim. Also is brought down corresponding to the 7 days of the week. There's a lot of these correspondence that we find. We had last week the numbers 24 and 12, but God's name, which actually corresponds to 24 hours of the day, the 12 months. It's a lot of correspondence. Here we have the 7 righteous people give life to the 7 days of the week, but particularly 7 different levels that enhance and nourish our souls. So it says like this. He is one of the 7 shepherds. They are the ones that give life and godliness. And by the way, parenthetically, this words here, we mentioned at the beginning of chapter 41 that there was a place where the Alter Rebbe spent a week or 2 or 3 discussing or thinking, should he add the Vav in Ikara Visharsha, by the Vav over there at the beginning of Tanya, in the beginning of chapter 41. Here also it says he had a very long time deciding, and either today at the end of the class or next week we'll talk about it. What was the issue of saying Chayas Ve'elikus, life and godliness, or life godliness? And there's a difference how you say it, and we'll get to that. We'll get back to that soon. But first, let's finish the point that the 7 shepherds give vitality and godliness to the souls of the Jewish people. And that's why they're called shepherds. Moshe Rabeinu, Moshe Rabeinu, of blessed memory, who kloles kulam, he includes all of them. So while there are 7 shepherds, each one has their particular path of what they give. Moshe Rabeinu is really a general one. He includes all of them, as we'll discuss right now. V'nikra Raya Mehemnan is called, as we see in the Zohar, is called the shepherd of faith. And the Hainu, that means Shemamshir Bechinas Hadas, he gives Das, and we'll explain what that is right now. The Klolis Yisrael, to the Jewish people as a whole. Leidas Hashem, to know Hashem. So what does this mean that he is a faithful shepherd? So first of all, there's a famous, I say famous in some of these things because we have discussed these a number of times. There's an idea that Raya Mehemna, faithful shepherd, could be translated in 2 ways. Either it means a faithful shepherd, meaning he's reliable. He's a shepherd that's trusted. He's reliable. You could rely on him. He'll do what's got to be done. He's faithful. Or you could say faithful shepherd means he's a shepherd of faith. He shepherds faith. He gives faith to the Jewish people. What does it mean he gives faith to the Jewish people? The Jewish people are called children of believers. We're called Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. One of the Mordechai ben David's popular songs. Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. We are believers, children of believers. What is Moshe Rabeinu doing to us? How is Moshe Rabeinu making us believers? So what it explains as follows. You see, having faith and applying and living with the faith are 2 separate things. It says a thief that's about to break into a home has faith. And what's the proof? Right before he breaks in and he hears a sound coming from somebody, he goes, oh God, please make sure no one's there. Or God, make me be successful. If you believe in God, why are you stealing? The answer is his faith and him are 2 separate things. It's like if you're traveling in a wagon full of food, and your wagon load is packed with food, or your car, I say wagon load because the story takes place many years ago, this particular story. If your car full of food, or you're not eating the sandwiches, you're going to be hungry, but I have so much food. It has to be internalized. Das, we have the word das, we know, is in the Torah used, and Adam knew Eve. The Adam yod es Chava. Literally, das means to know. But knowing is really, in biblical and in scientifically speaking, in Hasidic terms, knowing means to connect with. When Adam knew Eve, it doesn't mean he knew who she was. It means he knew her. He was intimate with her. They connected. And that's how they had children. That's as explained in the Hasidic, the whole concept. In other words, knowing means, das means I become one with it. I understand it. In other words, I eat it. What does a shepherd do? A shepherd's job is to make sure the sheep have what to eat. Not just the sheep have what to eat. They know. The shepherd knows what each sheep needs. We know the famous role model, the famous example of King David is brought down, and Moshe Rabeinu, why they were such great shepherds, meaning practically speaking, because they knew which sheep to take to the field when. First, they would take the youngest sheep, who had the small, the weakest mouths. They would eat the softest grass. Then they would take the oldest sheep, who would take then the next level of the grass that was a little tougher, a little harder, a little lower down. Then they bring the young bucks, the big strong sheep, that would come and eat the hard roots of the grass. Meaning he knew each sheep what they needed. He knew which one was thirsty and when to bring them to the. A good shepherd knows how to nourish each individual sheep perfectly, on its age, on its style of eating, etc. These shepherds, all 7 shepherds, nourished and gave the Jewish people to be sustained by Torah in each level that is required. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes. Moshe Rabeinu was the one that made sure all these came in a format of das, that you connect with it. The story the Rebbe mentioned a few times by Farbrengen is the story of this ignorant man who gets a letter from his mother. And in the letter, he doesn't know how to read it because he's, when I say ignorant, he's illiterate. I'm sorry, he's illiterate. And he goes to the shtetl wise man to read the letter to him. And the guy reads the letter, and the mother writes that your dad became very sick and this and that. And eventually tells her dad passed away. And the person listening to this letter starts getting emotional, and he starts getting crying, and then eventually he collapses on the floor when he hears his father died. And the question is, as the Rebbe points out at the Farbrengen, why did the scholar who read the letter not get so emotional? He understood a lot better the idea of life and illness and all these, the concept of what it means, and he understood it much more. He read the letter, yet he was unemotional. Why? Because it wasn't taken personally. He didn't internalize it. It wasn't nothing to do with him. It had nothing to do with me. It was only the person who was talking about his father who passed away. Him, it was personal. It meant something. It's no different than if you're discussing a court case in a textbook or a court case about your loved one. Suddenly, the whole thing matters. There's a big difference. If it's mine, I internalized it. That's the point of das. Das means it's not disconnected. The way the Rebbe Rasha, the fourth Rebbe of Chabad, explained it once. He saw once they were getting very excited, and somewhere in the mid-1800s, where the first locomotive came to their town, and they invited all the rabbis and the people to come and be there at that moment. That he happened to be there, and he sees the locomotive it's the first time this train with the locomotive is coming to their place in the Ukraine or wherever it was at the time, and the train comes and the locomotive is puffing and huffing and making the noise and the clanging, and finally it starts moving, but all the cars behind it stayed there because someone forgot to link the locomotive to the cars. In other words, if you don't have the connection, all the noise doesn't help, all the effort doesn't help, all the work doesn't help. Moshe Rabeinu is the one who connects das. Das means it's connected, it means something, it applies to me. Therefore, not just what I'm learning is something fascinating in my mind, but it transforms me. Or in very blunt terms, it's the difference between putting a sandwich on top of your stomach and putting a sandwich and chewing it and swallowing it. One, you digest it, and it becomes part of you. It becomes you. You are the sandwich. You became one. And this is what Moshe Rabeinu does. His job is to feed faith. So going back to the Jewish person, of course, we naturally have an ingrained faith in God. That's why the thief prays to God before he steals. That's why people who are doing things wrong and they're about to be busted pray to God. They shouldn't get caught. But if you take the faith and you internalize it, no longer is it disconnected from you, it changes you. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu's job was. His job was to take all the experiences of Judaism and make it relevant, but more than so, make it affect you and be meaningful to you. That is the role of Moshe Rabeinu as a shepherd. So going back inside here, V'nikra Raya Mehemna, he is called a faithful shepherd, the shepherd of faith. The Hainu Shemamshich Bechinas Hadas. He draws down das, the connection, the making the Judaism not just inspirational, nice ideas, but making it meaningful to me personally. The Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people, Leidas Hashem, to know God. Kol echet kefi hasagas neshmasa, each one according to his soul. And again, we're going to jump back in concept here, what we spoke in the very beginning of Tanya, and that is Vishorsho Lamaila Vinikasa Mishoresh Nishamas Moshe Rabeinu Shalom. This idea is the second time we're discussing this in Tanya. We're going to get into the idea of two things. Number one, all souls really emanate and come from the same place, more or less. They all come from the highest place, part of godliness in its highest form. But they come down here in different ways. Sometimes they come down in a way where they're completely affected by the journey, where the famous metaphor is about a guy traveling to Australia. There's two ways to get there. You can sit in the first class of this modern day planes that you land in Australia 16 hours later, as fresh and as comfortable and as vibrant as the moment you left, possibly more because you were pampered so well. Or you could take the milk run where you're sitting in the cargo section of the plane. That's where I sit usually. And there's all the squishy, you barely fit in the seat and your knees don't work and it's a little bit squishy and it's uncomfortable and you can't really rest. And by the time you get there and you have 5 stopovers, by the time you get there, you age 2 years and you're exhausted. And I came from the same place this guy, but we arrived differently. The soul coming down to this world could either come directly to this world, or it can come through a journey. And the journey means that it comes down from Atzilus to Beria to Yetzirah to Asiya. And the soul of this world is a very, I don't want to say modified soul, but a compromised in its expression soul. And that's the average story. Great tzaddikim come direct. But there's one tzaddik that says that wasn't at all affected at all. We know when you have a name of a tzaddik mentioned in the Torah more than once, you have that it mentions his name, and then there's if you look in the Chumash, almost like a comma, but it's really a musical note, which means pause. And you have, let's say, Hashem says Avraham, or Hashem called out to any one of the great tzaddikim in the Torah that's mentioned. You find a pause when the name is listed twice, except Moshe Rabeinu. Moshe Rabeinu has no pause, and as Zohar says, Moshe, no pause. Why? Because the same Moshe that was found in Atzilus in heaven, that's exactly what we see here. He is identical to the way he was. In other words, Moshe is the single example in history of the great shepherds that is down here as he was in heaven, no difference. His relationship with man came as a representative of God in his most lofty form. But the souls of his generation and all generations, each one's different. So Moshe Rabeinu is able to inspire and give over to each soul based on its ability. Some souls, as Frida mentioned, the souls of the generation of Moshe Rabeinu, yep, they received a much higher, much loftier level of light and teachings and